The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. As Jesus passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents? What, that he was so born blind?" And Jesus answered, "Well, neither. Neither he nor his parents sinned. It is so that the works of God might be made visible through him. We do not do the works of one who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." And when he said this, he spat on the ground, and then he made some clay with the saliva, and he smeared the clay on the eyes of the man, and he said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went and washed and came back and was able to see. His neighbors and those who had seen him earlier as a beggar said to him, "Isn't this the one who is used to sit and beg?" And some said, "Well, it is." But others said, No, it just looks like him." And he said, "I am." And so they said to him, "Well, how is it that your eyes were opened?" And he replied, "Well, the man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and told me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' And so I went there and I washed and I was able to see." Well, and then they said to him, "Well, where is he?" And he said, "I don't know." So they brought the one who was once blind to the Pharisees. And now Jesus had made clay and opened up his eyes. He told them that. And so the Pharisees also asked him how he was able to see. And he said to them, "Well, he put clay in my eyes, and I washed, and now I can see." So some of the Pharisees said, "Well, this man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath." But others said, "Well, how can a sinful man do such things?" And there was a division among them. So they said to the blind man again, "What do you have to say about him since he opened your eyes?" The man said, "He is a prophet." Now the Jews do not believe that he had been blind and gained his sight until they summoned the parents of the one who had gained his sight. And they asked the parents, "Is this your son who was born blind? And now does he see?" And his parents answered and said, "We know that it is our son, and he was born blind. We do not know how he sees now, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age. He can speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, and the Jews had already agreed that if anyone acknowledged him as the Christ, he would be expelled from the synagogue. For this reason, his parents said, "He is of age. Question him." So the second time they called the man who was born blind and said, "Give God praise. We know that this man is a sinner." He replied, "If he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know is that I was blind, and now I see." So they then said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" And he answered, "I told you already, and you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" They ridiculed him and said, "You are that man's disciples. Well, we are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but we do not know where this one is from." The man answered and said to him, "This is what is so amazing, that you do not know where he is from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. If one is devout and does his will, he listens to him. It is unheard of that anyone can open the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he would not be able to do anything." Well, they answered and said to him, "You were born totally in sin, and now you are trying to teach us?" And they went and threw him out. When Jesus heard that he had been thrown out, he found him and said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" And he answered and said, Who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" And Jesus said to him, "You have seen him. The one speaking to you is he." And he said, "I do believe, Lord," and he worshipped him. Then Jesus said, "I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see might see, and those who do see might become blind." Some of the Pharisees who were with him heard this and said to him, "Surely we are not also blind, are we?" And Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you are saying, 'We see,' so your sin remains." The Gospel of the Lord. A man said, "I told you, and you would not listen. You do not see. What is so amazing is that this man opened my eyes." And Jesus said, "I came into the world for judgment, so that those who do not see might see." Amazing. Amazing grace shall always be my song of praise, for it was grace that bought my liberty. I do not know just why he came to love me so. He looked beyond my fault and saw my need. Well, this song I heard many years ago at a regular ordinary Lenten Mass in Washington, D.C. There was a gospel choir there, and they began to sing because of the lyrics. I thought it was the Amazing Grace. But then I realized, well, that's not the music to Amazing Grace. And then I realized that music I know from somewhere. And then I realized, oh my goodness, that's the music to Danny Boy, sort of put to the lyrics of Amazing Grace, kind of. Well, I realized that this gospel choir was using a song that had been developed in the 1970s by a gospel singer named Dottie Rambo, where she did that. She had this sort of talk about an amazing grace that was given to us through Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection, and now that amazing grace is catching our soul and carrying us along. And she used that Londonderry air, the music to Danny Boy, to create the song. Well, "He looked beyond my fault and saw my need" is one of my favorite church songs at this point. In today's gospel, there's a way in which Jesus looks beyond the fault of the man born blind and sees his need, and maybe in some ways looks beyond the fault of everybody involved in this complex and rich story with many layers and many characters. And he's able, I think, to ask everybody to come to see where they can be in a new place, be with each other in a new way. You see this man born blind, his parents, his neighbors, the Pharisees. There's a whole bunch of others here and there. Even the Pharisees are split into two different groups that don't get along with each other. There's a whole cast in this whole story, this rich story, as I said. And I would argue that everyone in this scene ends up discovering that they are blind in some way, and that this encounter with Jesus opens them up to new things, new possibilities for themselves, and gets them to a new place and into new knowledge. How are they all blind? Well, the man born blind sees himself as a sinner being punished by God because he's got this affliction from birth. Either he's being punished or his parents are being punished, because that was the way that the theology of the time understood that kind of disability. And so he may also see himself limited to being just that person who happens to be disabled and not see many more possibilities for himself. The parents, it's the same. They may think, why were we so punished? And we're sort of stuck with this lot, and we're defined by it to some extent. The neighbors only know him as a beggar and see him in a certain way, and so much so that that when he finally sees, they're like, "Is that him? Are you sure that's him?" "Yeah, that's him." And then the Pharisees, of course, see everything according to categories that they've been given, and those categories limit them. And everyone there sees them as putting everything in the right bucket, except they start to disagree with each other. And we see that the Pharisees begin to maybe break open from those predetermined categories. And even Jesus learns to be able to see that these people really are willing to respond to him and come into a new place and grab onto this new way of being with each other, this kingdom, this reign of love. And so I think there's a way in which, in the end, everybody's transformed to a new place and a new understanding. This, in some ways, reminds me of our own need, and Lent may really emphasize that for us, to bring out of ourselves this way in which we can be finding ourselves with a new understanding, receiving a new grace and insight in this holy season, and find ourselves being able to be transformed just a little bit. Lent asks us to back off, and look and take a breath and in fact, gain a new perspective. And that new perspective, I think, is what Jesus is saying we always need to do periodically in our own lives, especially when there's a lot going on and there's a lot of characters, and the world in some ways seems to be moving in a kind of chaotic way. Well, as I mentioned at the beginning of Lent, I think there's a real way in which we're looking at how to look into the fray of life and the world, the craziness of the world, which is very hard to read and predict, and to be able to gain the grace that we need in order, I think, to follow where love is leading us. I keep having that one quote from the paleontologist Teilhard de Chardin. He said, the most telling and profound way of describing the evolution of the universe, it would be to undoubtedly to trace the evolution of love. And I think you and I are challenged to trace the evolution of love in the cast of characters we deal with every day in the world that seems to be so frenetic, and in our lives where there's a lot going on. And Lent invites you and I to do that. We do that, of course, at this midpoint or past the midpoint of Lent. And really today, although the feast is moved to tomorrow, today is the feast of St. Joseph, the patron of St. Joseph's University where I work. St. Joseph, I think, was a man who was able to constantly in his life be able to get the grace to back off and gain a wider perspective and then make a wise choice. He was known as the wise and just man. And Joseph, I think, is a model for us of what I think Jesus is trying to accomplish with all of these folks in today's gospel, getting us to break out of old categories that limit us and be able to be open within ourselves and to each other in a way that we can become a new community, a renewed community. And so I think there's a way in which Joseph was able to do that as he reconsidered his girlfriend and her situation, as he reconsidered what he was to do with his young family, so he fled to another country, as he came back into his own home country and set up a life raising this child with his wife. And he was able to be a man who could always be open to a reset, to new perspectives, and to receiving a grace that God was going to give him at that point in his life so that he knew what he was to do in the next chapter of his life, to live it fully and deeply and by God's will and through God's love, to be a practitioner of that love in the best possible way at each moment in his life. And you and I are invited to consider that same thing at this point in our Lenten journey on this feast of St. Joseph. May we be open and able to understand that we too, often enough, need to step back and gain a reset, a perspective, you might say. And like all of the characters in today's gospel, including Jesus himself, we can engage each other in a new way and reconsider how we ought to be with each other and to be able to accept the grace that we need in order to be the best possible selves in this new chapter of our story. May this allow us then to be able to see and keep catching that grace that is always there for us, looking beyond our fault and instead meeting our need. That old song, that old gospel song to the tune of Danny Boy, it goes, I shall forever lift mine eyes to Calvary, to view the cross where Jesus died for me. How marvelous the grace that caught my falling soul. He looked beyond my fault and saw my need. Well, today Jesus is willing to look at us with all that's going on, all the cast of characters we may be, look beyond our fault and see our need, and see the need for us to come to a new place with new knowledge by God's grace. Amen.